Hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar Making TSMO More Effective Through Active Management. My name is Kevin Vita, and I'll be helping with facilitating today's webinar. This webinar is sponsored by the Federal Highway Administration and hosted by the National Operations Center of Excellence, also known as NOCO. As a quick reminder, if you don't know already, at NOCO we offer a variety of resources to support the transportation systems management and operations community. On the lower right side of your screen, you can see a box called Useful Links. You can browse through those links for TSMO resources and news. Previous webinar recordings related to this topic can also be accessed from there. Now I'll cover a few logistics for today's webinar. We are recording this webinar, and the recording along with the presentation slides will be available through the on-demand learning section of our website. All of the attendees are in listen-only mode by default, but we would like you to stay engaged by using the question and discussion pod for comments and questions. We have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, so if you have any questions, we encourage all of you to enter them in the questions pod as they come to your mind at any time. The questions will be read out loud one at a time by the moderator, and our presenters will answer each question. So that's all I have, and with that, I'll hand it over to our moderator, Les Jacobson, to start us off.
Thanks, Kevin. So today's webinar is really about how we can make all of our TSMO strategies more effective through active management. We'll go through what active management is and then present a self-assessment that we've developed as part of this FHWA project, and kind of walk through a hypothetical situation and to show what that self-assessment might look like, and then we'll end with some questions and discussion, get your views on this. So to begin, let me introduce myself. I'm Les Jacobson with WSP, and I am the principal investigator for this project, and I will pass it on to James Collier to introduce himself.
Thanks, Les. Yeah, this is James Collier. I work for the Federal Highway Administration, Headquarters Office of Operations, and the co-lead of our Active Transportation Demand Management, or ATDM program. And I'm the Government Task Manager for this project that we're going to be talking about today.
Okay, Reno, you want to? Yeah.
Yes, this is Reno Giordano, also of WSP. I've been a researcher on this project, focused primarily on the self-assessment tool that we'll be covering as part of this webinar. So we also have Stephanie Palmer of Michigan DOT joining us as well next.
Hi, this is Stephanie Palmer, and as Reno said, I'm from Michigan Department of Transportation. I'm a traffic safety and operation engineer who was actively involved in our first active traffic management system, and I had the opportunity recently to do the self-assessment that we're going to be talking about today.
And this is Lisa Burgess with Kinley Horn, and I've been a partner to WSP on various aspects of the guide development and the workshops.
Thank you, everyone. So the goals of this webinar really are to introduce kind of a formal definition, you might say, of active management and the active management cycle. So we're going to introduce that and introduce it as a way that by thinking of this active management cycle, you can see ways to improve any TSMO strategy that you may have. We will then introduce the self-assessment framework tool to assess the level of active management that you're currently at. So you would do that assessment. It's not anything that anyone from outside would be looking in for, and that will also help to maybe uncover some places where improvements could be prioritized. we'll be presenting a peers kind of practitioner perspective. That's what Stephanie will be talking about, and she'll be talking about how they went through the self-assessment and what value that was to them. And as I mentioned, then we'll show kind of an application, a hypothetical application of this framework tool. With that, I'm going to pass it on to James, and he can give some of the background and context for active management.
Okay, thanks, Les. So yeah, just a little bit of background. So within the TSMO community, and if you are in the TSMO community, this is probably not new to you, but there's been a number of interesting and exciting developments over the last 5 years. One of those is improved focus on performance. A lot of the SHARP 2 program brought a lot of focus to reliability performance measures, which is very helpful to TSMO strategies. So we have the capability now to understand the performance of our facility, not only in real time, but also on a periodic and annual performance monitoring kind of report basis. Just a lot of new technologies. Could probably say this at any point in time, but new technologies and improved field and TMC procedures that are available to TSMO practitioners now through just better detection capabilities, real-time video analytics capabilities, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, machine learning, decision support systems. The list kind of goes on, but just technology speaking, we have a lot of capabilities at our fingertips now that we used to talk about as a research topic or something coming in the future. Kind of in parallel with the technological improvements, there's also been a real improvement and focus on the agency's institutional capabilities, and this is really kind of ushered in with the SHARP 2 TSMO capability maturity model, and then a lot of individual TSMO strategy capability and maturity frameworks have come along the last 5 years that have really put a focus on helping agencies improve their institutional organizational capabilities. And TSMO program plans is kind of a follow-on to that as well. A lot of agencies are developing or have developed TSMO program plans. So a lot of the TSMO pieces are in place now for agencies in ways that weren't in place before. And now there's a focus on, okay, we understand that TSMO is good, the agencies have it as part of their core functionality. Now, how can we make it more effective? So that's, I think, where a lot of agencies are at. And that's kind of what we're talking about here with active management. At a high level, what is active management? Those two words are very vague when you put them together, active and management. But when we talk about applying active management to TSMO, it's really taking a dynamic, performance-based approach to transportation management. It focuses on the present and immediate future, not only understanding what's going on in real time, but also predicting in the short term what's going to happen in the future. Really recognizing that there's no such thing as a typical day or typical condition or peak hour, that there's conditions are always changing, and our TSMO capabilities need to be always changing as well in responding to that. Thinking about customers instead of vehicles, moving away from like level of service and vehicle throughput and capacity kinds of measures to focusing more on individual customers and individuals as they make their trips and how we can help them optimize their trip and also at the same time improve the system performance. And then recognizing the system operation is, of course, 24/7, not just looking at peak conditions. We really need to manage conditions whenever and wherever people travel. So that's at a high level. That I recognize it's kind of vague, maybe still. So let me drill down a little bit deeper. The kind of concept of active management came about maybe about 10 years ago when the Federal Highway ATDM program first originated. The ATDM concept, active transportation demand management, can really be subdivided into three main categories: actively managing demand, managing traffic, and managing parking. And so all of these kind of fit together into a proactive, holistic approach to managing your system. Demand management in the active sense is looking at not just the traditional TDM approaches of carpooling and ride matching, but helping individuals in real time make choices that improve their condition based on whatever's going on the roadway. So this could include things like congestion pricing, advanced travel information, and dynamic ride sharing. Active traffic management really gets at that suite of strategies that are intended to improve the condition once drivers have made the choice to be on a particular roadway. How can we manage that roadway to the best of its abilities? So these are kinds of strategies like dynamic or variable speed limits, queue warning, part-time shoulder use, adaptive ramp metering, and so on. And then a lot of times we forget about parking. That's a key component to an individual's trip, and so there's a suite of strategies also available to actively managing parking facilities. Okay. So when we talk about actively managing demand, you can really think about it about the trip chain and how individuals make individual choices. Not only where they start their trip or where they're going, but all the things in between, like what time they're going to leave, what mode are they going to take, what route are they going to take, and what lane are they going to take once they're on the facility. ATDM postulates that all of these can be favorably influenced and optimized in real time based on what the conditions going on. So we seek to actively manage the demand in all parts of the trip chain, and before, during, and at the end of the trip chain, and that's something that we think is possible with ATDM kinds of approaches. So getting back to TSMO and how active management relates to that, more effective TSMO in a sense is dependent on a number of things besides just funding and staffing capabilities, but more holistically, one of the things that TSMO effectiveness is based upon and dependent upon is how actively managed those TSMO strategies are. So active management gets at not what TSMO strategies are in place, but how they're in place. And so the more actively they're managed instead of reacting or responding, the TSMO effectiveness can really increase. And that's a quote there from that's a Federal Highway primer. But let me just read that real quick. Transportation agencies cannot simply provide transportation infrastructure and maintain it. Or I would even amend that to cannot simply provide ITS infrastructure and maintain it. They need to play a role in actively managing that infrastructure and services and system to get the maximum performance from the investment. So you may be thinking, well, that's great, and I understand the importance of active management. We try to do that in our agency, but how do we do that? So that's really the purpose of this project and this webinar. One way to think about active management more discreetly is to think and break down how the individual functions that is any TSMO strategy is built upon, and that's what we call the active management cycle. So the active management cycle is a set of 4 steps that are interlocking and related to each other, and they feedback. It's a feedback loop, so they all in a continuous circle. These are the core functions that any ITS or TSMO strategy has to perform, whether it's done through a manual process or an algorithm. There's the steps that starts with monitoring the system. This is having a real-time situational awareness of what's going on your system. This could be based upon historic data to provide a future prediction of what your system's going to be like. But this is really the core and the foundation of TSMO is having a good situational awareness. Once you have that, then it feeds into assessing the system performance. And this is really going beyond just knowing what my problems are to understanding are the conditions acceptable or not? What are my system performance objectives, which are based upon my agency goals and objectives? And in real time, is my performance acceptable, or is it meeting desired thresholds? And if not, then I should be evaluating and recommending dynamic actions, which is the next step. And so that's identifying the appropriate dynamic actions through the TSMO strategies that you have implemented within your agency or region. And what are the best combinations of those dynamic actions and for the particular condition on your roadway identified by monitoring step. And then you implement the preferred dynamic action. So it all feeds back around to monitoring. So the key here is this cycle is intended to be viewed as a real-time cycle, and these steps fit together. And the better you can do these steps and the more interlocked they are, and the shorter the latency between identifying problem and implementing dynamic action, then the more effective your TSMO system is going to be. So I just kind of told some of these, but the benefits of the active thinking about your TSMO strategies through an active management cycle lens is you can improve individual steps in the cycle. You can improve shortened latency or time lags between the steps. And these can all improve outcomes for not only maybe you as an agency practitioner understanding how your system is working and responding to your operational strategies. That could provide improved system efficiency and effectiveness, but it can also allow you to provide your customers or your travelers more timely and accurate information. So the active management cycle really has a benefit of helping you reduce the latency or time lags between changing conditions and the application of TSMO strategies. Real quick, so just one way to think about it, many agencies could be happening, every single day as you're looking at your system through CCTV cameras or detectors, and you notice a problem forming. These problems form very quickly. This could be a recurring bottleneck that forms, or this could be a non-recurring event like an incident that's causing this congestion. But these slides 1 minute apart show just how quickly conditions can change and the importance of reducing the latency between problem identification or even problem forecast or prediction and the dynamic action that you can take. It's the direct effectiveness of your TSMO response is contingent upon how quickly you can respond and identify these problems. Let me introduce one more thing here, then I'll turn it over to Reno. This is the concept of active management levels. So these are evolutionary steps that usually agencies make, starting from the bottom where you're statically managing your system, to reactive all the way up to proactive at the top. And the further up you go, the more actively you're managing your operations. So this also gives more detail about what we mean by active management. The lower levels are low risk and proven. The upper levels are more high complexity and high reward, but also high reward, more benefits. So it kind of starts with static management. I think most agencies are kind of beyond this, but this is kind of like a set it and forget it mentality. Your TSMO responses are preset. They're updated based on the calendar, perhaps, or maybe policy or law. Then you move up to reactive. This is where your strategy responses could change when there are observed problems with your static plans. So there's still not a lot of real-time monitoring capabilities or maybe gaps in your real-time monitoring capabilities, but you do have some capability of reacting to problems that occur. Next step up is responsive, where now you are more actively monitoring real-time conditions. You have a better situational awareness, and you have a lower latency and capability to be able to implement dynamic actions in response to those changing conditions. And then the last step is proactive, and this really gets at not only real-time conditions, but anticipation of future conditions. And so this could kick in like maybe the need for a short-term prediction system, where you're not only reacting to things or responding to things, but you are implementing things in anticipation of problems occurring. So let me wrap up my introduction with, if we can combine these two concepts of the active management cycle steps with the levels of active management, you get what we call the active management framework, and this is really the foundation for the self-assessment tool that we've developed with this project, and that Reno will get more in detail here as I pass it over to him.
Yes, great. Thank you, James, for that introduction. So I'll pick up from here to talk a bit more about the active management framework, which, as James said, combines the concepts of the active management cycle and those 4 steps with the 4 levels of increasing active management, static, reactive, responsive, and proactive. So the framework, which is not complicated, that this project assembled, is shown here and is represented in an essential matrix. And what we have are the 4 steps in the active management cycle, shown down the first column there, and arrayed against the 4 levels of increasing active management across each row. So when you combine the 2, you end up with this matrix, and there is relatively simple and high-level criteria associated with every box in the table. So the purpose of this is to allow agencies to look at this matrix and assess or judge the level of active management for a TSMO strategy or group of strategies on the basis of each step in the active management cycle. So again, the criteria here are meant to be high level, applicable to any TSMO strategy, and technology agnostic. And we'll get a bit more into how you apply this in the sense of the self-assessment tool that this project identified or put together. But just simply to state first here that each of these criteria can be applied to where the agency believes it's operating currently with the TSMO strategy that you wish to look at. And then by looking at sort of the next box to the right for each step in the cycle, you can identify a target outcome that you would like to move toward by identifying certain actions or recommendations to take to make such an improvement. And you'll kind of recognize this overall concept if you're familiar with the capability maturity model applied to TSMO generally or TSMO strategies, which is another tool that many agencies have taken advantage of over the past number of years to improve certain processes and organizations around TSMO. So conceptually, it's somewhat the same, but we're talking about increasing levels of active management and the active management cycle steps. And since we are focusing on a cycle here, another important aspect to the active management framework is consideration of the transition characteristics between each cycle step. So again, you remember the colorful circle moving from monitoring to assessing to evaluating and to implementing in a cyclic and repeated fashion. It's important to consider how the outcome of each of those steps informs the next step. So if you look down one of the active management columns here, for example, you can see how it's important to make sure that monitoring results are effectively communicated and used in the assessment step that follows. And then similarly, a timely and accurate assessment would be key to evaluating and recommending actions. So the transition from one step to the next, or the information and the communication that gets passed on, becomes very important. And there's an essential goal to kind of reduce the time taken between one step in the cycle to the next, or the latency between one step in the cycle to the next. So again, you can array those steps against the 4 levels of active management and look at some generalized criteria for each of those pairs in this matrix. So this is kind of that next level of looking at active management, or another aspect of it that becomes important and is built into the self-assessment process as well. This is another aspect that becomes important to look at. So that effectively concludes kind of the introduction to active management itself and the framework around which this project really revolves and forms the heart of a document that that the project produced, meant to provide some guidance to agencies, and of course it forms the heart of the self-assessment tool, which is what we want to talk about in a moment. So, as I was saying, this project produced an active management cycle document, which has been targeted at, as shown on the slide here, senior managers with TSMO responsibility, traffic management center managers, and managers of specific TSMO strategies. So the content of the document that the project produced really focuses on a lot of the information and concepts that James spoke about. So it defines what active management is and how it's applicable to all TSMO strategies. It presents the active management cycle and outlines how it can help agencies actively manage their existing systems and apply that to more effective TSMO strategies. It identifies the active management cycle steps. And as I was saying before, the heart of it is really this self-assessment tool that allows agencies to look at their current ability in applying the active management cycle, understand where improvements may lie based on the framework that we've shown, and identify actions to make those improvements so that the level of active management for each step in the cycle can be improved, and then lastly, the document also describes the incremental levels of active management as the effectiveness of each TSMO strategy is increased from static to proactive. And as we were saying, the applications of which can be applied to a single TSMO strategy, a group of strategies, or used as kind of a regional collaborative exercise. And that has been done a few times in a pilot workshop. So before we get into discussing more about the active management cycle self-assessment itself, again, which is based on the framework we've shown, we'll move first to hearing from Stephanie Palmer at Michigan DOT. She and her agency was one of the first to apply the active management cycle self-assessment and framework in a workshop setting to their flex route corridor. And so she'll talk briefly about the application of that, what they got out of the workshop, and how the Michigan DOT is using the results. And then I'll come back and talk a little bit about the self-assessment process specifically. So, Stephanie?
Thank you. So, as Reno mentioned, my name is Stephanie Palmer, and I work for the Michigan Department of Transportation. And a few months ago, we took part in the self-assessment for active management. And we used a project that we had just recently implemented. Well, it's been operational for 3 years. We call it the flex route. So it is, let me see, I think that's there. There we go. So this is kind of a schematic of what it looks like. So it's about 8 miles long near Ann Arbor, and the system actually uses several active traffic management strategies. So we're using dynamic shoulder use to open and close the shoulder during peaks and congestion. We also have full dynamic lane use, variable speed advisories, and a queue warning system. So we use this project, which has been operational for 3 years, to do our self-assessment. And what we really found beneficial about it is the and you saw the kind of the matrix that you would walk through, it kind of engaged us in the conversation we needed to determine where we were with our active traffic management now and where we want to be. We found that in general we were pretty responsive. Our system in general is responsive, but it also made us kind of think about, do we want to go further toward a more proactive system, and then what actions we would need to get to that next level. So it was super, the most beneficial part was it helped us have the conversation we needed to know what we would need to do if we want to move further up that scale toward proactive. One of the lessons learned for our department really was we probably should do the assessment again, just looking at each one of our ATM strategies. It was a little overwhelming for us to try to take, dynamic shoulder use, dynamic lane use, variable speeds and queue warning, and talk about them all at once, because what we found is certain aspects of our system were more responsive than others. There were a few pieces maybe that were still a little reactive, and then there were a few things that were a little more proactive. For example, we do alerts for congestion. As congestion builds, we do have a proactive alert to open up our shoulder. However, we still manually clear that shoulder to open it, which is a little more reactive. So there's different things that we're doing that are at different levels. So that's probably our biggest lesson learned is, maybe we do it again and try to stay with the smaller strategies so we can really see what it would take to move each one of those strategies. But overall, it was a great benefit for us because it started that conversation that we needed. And now I'll turn it back over to Reno to continue his discussion.
Yes, thanks, Stephanie. So I'll just conclude here by talking a bit more about the details of the self-assessment. So, what exactly is in the document, or what did Stephanie and her colleagues use to come to those results about their flex route in terms of the self-assessment. So the tool, which is based on the framework I talked about earlier, is really comprised three kind of simple steps. One, you want to first define the scope of the self-assessment, then actually conduct it, which is really the most involved and important aspect of it. And that, again, will involve assessing each of the individual management cycle steps and the transitions between them, and determining the level of active management. Following that, kind of brainstorming and formulating actions that would then allow you to move up the steps in the cycle for the levels of the cycle, levels of active management for each of the steps. Sorry about the terminology. And then interpret those results to confirm the actions and kind of the plan forward that you want to take. So let's look at each of these just a bit more. Starting with defining the scope is fairly self-evident. It really is helpful to, before getting into it, kind of define the purpose and goals, what the strategy is, who the stakeholders are, what are you really trying to get out of the self-assessment in terms of improving your strategy, including identifying what that is or the group of strategies. And as Stephanie noted, their application of it looked at a group of 4 active traffic management strategies, and perhaps in hindsight it would have been simpler to take them one by one. So that's a particular consideration when it comes to the selection of the strategies that you want to focus on. And then, of course, the geographic scope, and certainly this process is applicable at the facility level, at the corridor level, or regionally. And depending on how you look at it, that may expand the group of agencies or partners or people that need to be brought in to kind of consider their contribution to the strategy that you're looking at. So once that's set, you move on to actually conducting the self-assessment, which really is based on that active management framework and going through the assessment. And you can do this sort of on paper using the document or in a facilitated environment in kind of a workshop, bringing together all the key people involved in the execution of the strategy to kind of walk through a set of questions or considerations about each of the steps as they relate to the levels of active management and determine where you are for each of them, as well as considering importantly those transitions between the steps, since we want to think about those steps in a cyclic fashion. So for example, we showed before in the framework there's very simple criteria there for each of those step and level pairs, but there are deeper considerations within each of those, and the document gets into this. The self-assessment tool presented in the document gets into this. For example, if you're talking about the monitoring step, there are certain things to think about with respect to monitoring, such as data. What type and the source of the data do you have available to you to monitor your strategy? The interval of that data's collection. What is the frequency with which you collect it? How current is the data that you have on which to base your assessment and decisions, the subsequent steps in the cycle? And then infrastructure. What instrumentation or sources of data, roadway instrumentation, CCTV, for example, do you have at your disposal to actually collect that data and bring it into a decision-making environment? So there are, as the document and tool gets into, areas to explore within each of these steps in the cycle so that you can appropriately consider all aspects of it and evaluate the appropriate level of active management. So at the end, you will have determined where you are in terms of level of active management for each of these steps, and you'll want to move on to the third step, interpreting what those results are. And this will inform kind of your general approach to improvement and target outcome in terms of active management for the strategy by step in the cycle. And again, you can use the framework to identify what those target outcomes are, and the document does provide some recommended guidance on things to think about in terms of advancing to that next level of active management and what the criteria are and characteristics of it that would get you there. And I'll just mention that there's kind of two general outcomes that you might see once you complete the assessment. You might find that the level of active management is more or less the same for each step in the cycle. So maybe they're all responsive. You're monitoring, you're assessing, you're evaluating and recommending actions, and then implementing those actions. We're all more or less responsive. In that case, you'll want to target the next step there across the board for each of those steps. Another kind of generalized outcome is you might find one or two of the steps are considerably lower or notably lower than others, and those really become the focus of your improvement because you'll want to bring them up to the same level as the other two steps in the cycle. So for instance, perhaps the assessment is lagging, is reactive, whereas all the other steps in the cycle are responsive. So you'll want to focus on actions that bring up the assessment step in the cycle to be responsive as well. And that will improve the overall outcome of the strategy. So we offer considerations in how to do that. So at this point, I'm going to pass it to Les, who is going to kind of dig a little deeper into this by presenting a hypothetical example, a hypothetical agency going through this assessment and thinking about how to improve a particular TSMO strategy that they're looking at. So Les?
Thanks, Reno. So in this case, the hypothetical agency is the Lincoln DOT, and what we're going to be looking at is their ramp metering strategy. So they have a ramp metering system. As they are thinking about it and kind of reflecting on how their system operates, the metering rates are calculated by the ramp controller using mainline detection adjacent to the ramp, and it also has ramp queue detections on the ramp, or detectors on the ramp, so it can detect how far back the queue is and then adjust the metering rate accordingly. They also monitor the operation of the ramp meters through their closed-circuit TV system. They also communicate with the ramps. They see the what the mainline conditions are through their ATMS system and the map that they have, but they don't have a central ramp metering algorithm. So they can see what's happening and make adjustments if needed to the ramp controller parameters, but they don't have a central algorithm. So as they think about that and kind of start to do this self-assessment, they feel that their system, they're able to monitor the network pretty well. They have real-time data. They actively monitor the conditions and the performance of that network. They've established some performance metrics. They include mainline travel time, and they do travel time reliability. They also look at the volumes on the freeway, the mainline throughput, and they also monitor and collect the ramp, the wait times at the ramp meters. They do an annual performance assessment, and when they do that performance assessment, they review the metering parameters. They will also review those parameters and make adjustments if there's something very noticeable that happens. Maybe in an incident condition, they see that their metering rates aren't really doing what they need to be done, and so they may adjust some parameters to reflect that. They also, as part of this whole assessment, as Reno mentioned, they want to take a look at really what their scope is. So their goal of doing the self-assessment is to improve the operational efficiency of the ramp metering system. When they think about stakeholders, it's certainly the TMC staff, those people who are operating the ramp meters, the local agencies, because the ramp metering could affect the arterial system. They also look at law enforcement as stakeholders, both in terms of response to incidents on the freeway, but also for enforcing any of the laws or trying to reduce violations of the ramp meters. They've selected ramp metering as their strategy, and they're not looking at a particular corridor here. They meter throughout the urban area, and so their geographic scope then is the entire region. So that provides some thought process for as people do the self-assessment to think of those things. Why are they doing the self-assessment? Who are their stakeholders? So they can think about what their needs are as they do the self-assessment, or maybe even bring in some stakeholders to help them with the self-assessment, and then also geographic scope. So this is a reflection of the tables that we have in the document. And as Reno mentioned, over in the left-hand column, there's more than just monitoring the system. This is where it breaks down to have people think a little bit about these different aspects of monitoring the system. So data collection, how well do they collect data? How do they process it? Do they have the ability to archive the data? What's the interval between the time that they get the data and they're able to act on it? What is the infrastructure that they have in place to collect and process data as well? And then this transition piece are they using data from the time that they made their previous adjustment as they monitor? So is this a continuous monitoring process that they can see what the changes are or in performance based on whatever their changes that they made in the system itself? And then do they pass that monitoring data onto the next step, which is assessing system performance? So as you saw earlier, essentially with monitoring the system at a static level, that's kind of they collect data, and then they really use averages that are updated periodically, whatever that might be, once a month, once a quarter, whatever the case may be. Reactive would be they still use the averages, but they do also capture any of the variations and events. So if there's an incident, they are able to monitor that and include it in their data system. Responsive would be that they capture real-time data, and so all of the temporal variations are captured as well. And then proactive not only has real-time data, but they're able to anticipate or forecast what might happen based on those real-time conditions. So, and in here, this shows the additional steps: assess system performance, evaluate and recommend actions, and implement dynamic actions. We'll take those on one at a time as we go, but we're first going to keep with the monitoring the system step. So again, just as a reminder, they felt they had effective real-time monitoring. They don't assess performance in real time or even near real time, though. They do their assessment of performance, and although they do look at performance after significant incidents or events or things like that. They evaluate and recommend actions then when they assess performance, and they incorporate the observations that they've made in their monitoring of unusual conditions within that evaluation and recommending actions. And then they implement the improvements that they have recommended in the evaluate and recommend step. So as they move forward then, because they have real-time data collection and they save that and archive it and they use it on their monitoring system overall in real time, they felt they were responsive in monitoring the system. So they moved on to looking at assessing system performance. And here again, there's some things that they need to think about. Do they have the data analytics needed to assess system performance, especially in a more responsive or proactive type of situation? Do they have good performance metrics? And do they apply those performance metrics, or how often do they do that? Do they use the most recent monitoring data when they do their assessment of system performance? And then finally, do they pass that assessment information on to the evaluate and recommend step? And again, you can see that the descriptions of the levels kind of reflect the descriptions of the levels for monitoring. So if their assessment is based solely on averages, that's more static. If they base it on averages but also incorporate some of these significant variations, it would be reactive. If they capture and do their system performance assessment really in real time and they see the varying conditions, we would call that responsive. And then if they look at their system performance based on how they anticipate conditions to be, or forecasted conditions, or predicted conditions, then it would be more proactive. So as they looked at that again, and they kind of had done their kind of overall assessment, they realized that they really only do this performance assessment annually. So they don't really do it in real time or near real time. And they do, however, do an assessment after significant incidents or events. And so when they looked at the table, they saw that that really fits in the reactive level. So they then moved on to looking at evaluating and recommending actions. And again, we have some things that you might want to think about, policies and standards. So are there policies in place to really allow this generation of actions and evaluating those actions and recommending them? Are there system performance objectives? So instead of just metrics, are they trying to hit a particular target? Are they looking not only at kind of averages on the system, but are they looking throughout all times a day and throughout their entire geographic area, at least the geographic scope that they're choosing to do the assessment on? And are they using the most recent assessment results from the previous steps as they do this evaluate and recommend, and then passing that recommendation on to the implementation step? One of the things I want to mention is that this can be done in real time through computer algorithms and things like that, as long as they have some of these policies and standards in place. They've looked at their performance objectives, and they're certain that their system can really look at the rest of these points that we mention here. Anyway, in a more static sense, it would mean that the adjustments are recommended based on the changes in averages. Reactive would be that the recommended adjustments are based on averages plus these observed kind of variations when there's significant incidents or events. Responsive would mean that they make these adjustments based on real-time data, essentially as close to in real time as possible. And then proactive would mean that the adjustments were based on anticipated, forecasted, or predicted conditions. So as they looked at that, they evaluate and recommend the actions when they assess performance, and they assess performance annually. They do incorporate the observations when they evaluate and recommend actions as well. And so because of that, they recommend adjustments based on observed temporal variations. And they're starting to think now that, boy, because our assessment piece was reactive, it would be really hard for us to be higher than reactive for the evaluate and recommend actions. But they move on to the implement dynamic actions. And again, there's some things that they want to think about. Do they have infrastructure that supports dynamic actions? Do they have procedures and protocols that really allow for implementing dynamic actions? Do they have the analytics to make sure that those are the right actions to be taken and to adjust as they implement? Is there enough agency coordination that occurs? And then finally, are they using the most recent recommendation from the previous step as they go in to implement actions. And again, this pretty much mirrors what we've seen for the levels, the characteristics of the levels in the previous steps. If the adjustments are based only on trend lines because they're using just the static information, essentially the averages that they've looked at, it would be static. If their adjustments are based on regular variations and trends, it would be reactive. If it's based on real-time information and especially if they can respond in real-time to real-time conditions, then it would be more responsive. And if they adjust based on what they are anticipating or forecasting or predicting to occur, it would be proactive. So as they look at how they would describe their implementation of dynamic actions, they say that they really implement those improvements after they've recommended the actions, and so not surprisingly, they also assess themselves at the reactive level for implementing dynamic actions. So they were pretty responsive in monitoring the system. However, they didn't really assess their system performance in real time. It was based on averages, and they did it annually. And then out of that annual performance evaluation was when they would generate, actions to try and improve the system, and they would implement those actions as they were as they recommended them. But they really started to see here that the assessing system performance was kind of what was holding them back. So we also included some pretty general thoughts on interpreting these results, and Reno mentioned them a little bit. One would be that if it's consistent choices for all 4 steps in the cycle, then you'd probably want to focus on strategies to advance all steps, or actions that would improve each step individually, and then how would that work together. So there again, we want to make sure that the transitions are considered, so that if they're monitoring and collecting data in real time, that gets passed on in real time to do the assessment step and kind of filters on down the line. Or if there's just 1 or 2 steps in the cycle that are holding them back, then you'd focus just on that lower level step. And so even though 3 out of the 4 steps are at the same level, reactive, they really thought that what's really holding them back is that assessment step. So they thought, okay, as we go into defining some actions, we want to focus on that assessment step, and particularly how they can do the assessment closer to real time. So to move on to the next, how they actually did this planning and what came up with it, I'd like to pass it on to Lisa.
Great. Thank you, Les. So Les walked us through, sort of a sample assessment and implementation. And as Les had stated, one of the big areas that was really holding Lincoln DOT back was sort of that assessment piece. So the group there, based on some of the results and through all the discussions, they kind of identified that in order for them to move from reactive to responsive, that there were a few key things that were, really sort of hindering that, things that they did not yet have. As we show here in terms of real-time data to be able to support metrics is really critical for being to move some of the performance measures forward. Being able to do some of those things in real time. Keep in mind, Lincoln was looking at this annually and maybe when there was a major incident or event, but not a lot of real-time performance analysis. In terms of being able to very quickly analyze, some of those automated analytics were needed to help formulate recommendations, formulate changes to strategies. And then, of course, kind of moving in between that transition from the performance measures, assessing performance, and then quickly formulating results and being able to implement them quickly, those were not happening. So we want to pose a question to the participants here on this webinar. If you were at Lincoln DOT and you had just gone through this assessment and identified some of these areas, what do you think Lincoln DOT could do to improve this assessment step? What might be some key recommendations that you could see coming out of this? And I'm going to pause for about a minute, and I'm going to encourage you to maybe put some thoughts into the chat. What ideas do you have on what they can do to improve this assessment step? I see we've got at least one person typing in some thoughts. Thank you, Doug. Others, feel free to jump in.
So, Lisa, I think Doug's entry into the pod was before you asked for this, and what I
was before the question.
Yeah, I think what he's asking for is if there's been a discussion
Okay.
on developing a web-based application of this assessment, and I was going to mention that later, but yes, kind of the final task that we have in this project is to take this assessment tool and put it in an online version, kind of similar to the CMF assessments or the CMM assessment also.
Very good. Well, I think we don't have a lot of participants. We'll go ahead and sort of share with the group a few, maybe some sample recommendations of what Lincoln could do based on some of the evaluation outcomes. There certainly is an opportunity here to maybe automate some of the performance analysis, recognizing that a lot of that was not happening necessarily in real time. Lincoln did have some good data, but some of it was also linked to some manual processes. So if there was maybe a way to automate some of that performance analysis, whether it's on a segment, with multiple ramp meters, maybe it's some particularly challenging, on-ramps or sub-segments, there could be an opportunity there to automate some of that performance analysis to be able to generate, maybe some faster recommendations. Also, perhaps maybe a dashboard that could display some of those performance metrics in real time. Again, a lot of the processes were really relying on, sort of after the fact or some manual performance analysis, but a dashboard that could show pretty quickly, provide a quick visual of what what that ramp performance was doing. Really might be able to aid that group in being a bit more responsive rather than reactive. Also being able to implement some sort of a, performance metrics database to allow for more offline analysis to be able to develop some of those improvements. So there was, there were several key things here that, Lincoln could do, really focus just on that assessment piece, and by improving that assessment piece, there could be some potential trickle-down benefits to some of the other steps in the process. other steps in the cycle. So in terms of the results, so Lincoln DOT goes through and improves their both the performance monitoring, develops up a dashboard, really looks to move the needle on going from reactive to responsive with the with the ramp metering. So they've now implemented, they already had some effective real-time monitoring, but they implemented a dashboard that facilitates a lot better real-time assessment of what's happening. They're able to, very quickly evaluate and recommend actions based on some of that performance. They've got a lot of processes that are now automated. Things are happening in real time. And as a result, they're able to implement those improvements pretty quickly after going through and formulating a response strategy. Things are not getting implemented after the fact, but almost closer to near real time in response to real-time conditions. So as we sort of revisit the table that Les presented that initially showed the monitor system step being, marked as responsive, but all of the three other steps were all considered to be very reactive. And just by moving that, implementing improvements on that assess system performance piece that moved it from reactive to responsive, the other two steps, evaluate, recommend, and implement dynamic actions, were also allowed to be able to move to a much more responsive characteristic. So it had a very noticeable trickle-down effect and enabled improvements within those other categories just by focusing on that assess system performance and making those improvements. Les?
Thanks, Lisa. So I did want to point out that Doug also put in a suggestion that in terms of when they're looking at action steps, one thing that they could do is do a peer review with other DOTs that have a ramp metering system and see what their system is like and what might be able to occur. Any questions or discussion that you would have? Do you think that this tool is would be helpful to you? Do you think it's something that you could do kind of just within your organization, or do you think it would need to be more through a facilitated discussion? Also, do you think an online kind of tool to help out would be beneficial? Anything that's on your mind, any questions, any thoughts on the questions that I posed? I might also just as you're thinking about that and adding some questions to the pod, I'm going to go back to one aspect here that has some characteristics. Boy, I have to go back further than I wanted. Some of the characteristics of their system. They don't have a centralized algorithm, and so because of that, it would be hard for them to get probably all the way to proactive. Especially because they wouldn't be able to kind of look at conditions and make adjustments based on conditions throughout the system. I think there are some people that are typing, so we can hold on for just a minute. But while we're waiting for that, James or Reno or Stephanie or Lisa, anything that you wanted to bring up as we're looking for the questions to come up?
Yeah,
well,
this is James, and I'll let sound like Lisa was going to talk about. So we have a few more workshops, virtual workshops with this active management cycle framework lined up. The Ohio DOT is actually starting tomorrow. and then Georgia DOT and Wyoming DOT. And then after that, we'll finalize the report that Les was talking about that in Reno that basically summarizes this active management cycle framework. That will be available later this year. Still have to go through our publications process. But if any other agencies are listening to this and are interested in doing a workshop virtually or in person when it's safe to do so around this self-assessment framework, let me know, and we can try to accommodate as many agencies that are interested in it.
Okay, we've got some questions in or kind of statements. Mia said an online tool would be great, particularly if it had some level of AI incorporated to provide prompts or recommendations. Also, kind of at a similar vein, Rashad said that the assessment tool is definitely beneficial. I think a web-based tool would be efficient in getting access to numerous agencies. Also, she wants to know if the presentation will be available after the meeting. And yes, I believe it will be available on the NOCO site, and I think the presentation itself might be available even now. There's I think, Kevin, do you want to mention when it will be available on the NOCO site and how people can get the presentation?
Sure, Les. At the end of the webinar, I can go back to the lobby layout, and the slide deck will be available at that in PDF format there. And as for the recording, it should be up on the NOCO website and YouTube channel within a couple days.
Great. Great. There are a couple other people who are typing in, so we'll wait for that. I think there was one more comment being typed. Vince says, I think the example you provided was very good, and he further appreciates Stephanie's willingness to give a real-world example. I think, and he says he's not asking a question because because I think we are thinking about how to improve our VSL operations through these examples. Okay, thanks, Vince. And we'll be talking to you more about that, Vince. Anything else from anyone? Okay, well, I want to thank you all for your attention and for participating in this workshop or in this webinar. James, do you have any final words?
Yeah, just echo Les's thanks, and thanks for joining us. A lot of material we went through today, so thanks for hanging in there. And again, if you have any further questions, feel free to contact myself or Les, and hopefully you can download the presentation and share the recording when it's available. And I think I see you, Kevin. Looks like you've changed the layout now that folks can download the slides, the PDF, to the download slides webinar pod. So thanks for doing that, Kevin. Thanks for NOCO's support, as always. Thank you, Kevin, getting this all set up and organized. Appreciate that. And thanks to our speakers, Stephanie, and Les, and Reno, and Lisa. So that's all I have. So thanks for joining us, and we will talk to you all later. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, James.